All right, welcome back everyone. This is the Happy Toolbox, and today I'm going to go over a part 2 somewhat of last week's tutorial where I showed you how to set up a connect object, some cloner objects, volume builder, and mesher, and create this really dynamic stylized snow scene that adapts to whatever geometry you put inside of it. There were quite a few questions asking about how I went about and did this texture on the snow in the thumbnail of the YouTube video, and so this week I thought I'd go over that. And not only will I go over that single texture, but I have these 3 variants of that texture that work really nicely, specifically within stylized snowy scenes. This is something I've searched around a lot for, and I always feel like I find a material that looks really good in someone's thumbnail, and then I put it in my scene and it looks horrible. So hopefully these are pretty straightforward and you can actually use them in your day-to-day projects. All right, let's get going. All right, so this should look pretty familiar. I just duplicated our snow setup scene from last week 3 times and put spheres inside of each of them instead of complex geometry. So it's the exact same thing. If I turn off the meshers, you can see it's the volume builders underneath. It's using cloner objects. And I just want to comment on this really quick because your geometry matters for texturing. So if I just put a cube in here that has flat sides everywhere, these snow textures aren't going to look the same. It's important to have some variance, especially when it comes to snow. You know, we have nice falling off edges. It's kind of rounded, so it's going to catch light really well. So that's important. So, you know, if you're doing some type of landscape, just make sure you have peaks and valleys inside of it. So let's get some lighting in here. So for my setup, I used kind of this directional sunny scene going on here. So to get that, I'm going to make sure my Octane viewer is running. Drag this up a little bit. I'm going to actually open the attributes panel a little bit more so we can see what's going on. I'm going to go to objects, lights, and just pick an Octane daylight. So that right away throws this daylight object inside of your scene. You can rotate this axis around to get exactly where you want. But before we do anything crazy with this, I want to make sure my Octane settings are set right. So if I go to the Octane settings, currently it is set to direct lighting. As I said in some previous tutorials, how I like to work is I like to use path tracing. And I just find this evens things out more. It's not as muddy and it works a little bit faster in general. So I actually have a preset up here called Optimize that I saved just when I was messing around with stuff that I really liked. I'm not a render master by any means, but this is kind of the settings I liked. I just dropped some of the specular depths down, etc. So let's set it to that. If you want, you can copy my settings. That's pretty much it. Nothing too fancy. But yeah, the main point is you want to set this to path tracing. And now we can start working with this. So if I go to the axis on this Octane daylight and I start rotating it around a little bit, as I have in my scene here, I have pretty short shadows you can see, and I also have them directionally turned. So I'm going to make sure the sun is pretty high above this scene. Say about there. And then I'm going to go over to world space so I can just turn the sun at that same angle, a little more angled like that. All right, let's take the craziness of the sun down a little bit. So sky turbidity, you can think of this as the sky is getting cloudier and cloudier. So if I turn this up, you can see everything kind of dims down and the lighting becomes a little more diffuse. So if I have this all the way down, it's just like the harshest sun you can possibly think of. It's the darkest shadows you can have. So I want to turn this up a little bit so we get our shadows being a little bit more opaque and it's a little less intense without us having to turn the power down too much. So let's go to about 5. It's feeling pretty good. And then power, let's turn that up a little bit, maybe like there. And sun size, this is where you can start messing with the sun size and make it dramatically huge so you don't have as hard of shadows. So if I turn this sun size up, you can see the shadows get pretty blurry. So let's put the sun size up to like 18 so we have a little bit blurrier shadows. And then let's get some color on this floor. So I'm going to go over to Create, Materials, Extensions, excuse me. Pick a C4D Octane material and pick Octane Material. I'm going to double click into this, and the important part here is I don't want a lot of reflections on the floor or anything like that since we're focusing on the snow. So let's make sure it's diffuse in the material type. And then I kind of want the same tan color I had prior. So let's go around here. All right, that's feeling pretty good. So let's just plop that on top of our spheres. And then also put it on our floor. Make sure your Octane is refreshed and going. So there, we've got a basic lighting setup going. Looks pretty similar to this. And now we can start working on these snow textures, which is the part you're here for anyway. Let's start with the most basic snow setup. So this one right here, which is a little more fluffy and bumpy snow, not as wet as the other ones. And to do that, I'm going to create a new material, materials, extension, C4D Octane, Octane Material, create a new one. And I'm going to drag that on Snow 1. And I'm going to go over to Material Type and change it to Glossy. Not sure why those have glossy. Whoops. Diffuse. Let's throw those ones back to diffuse. Okay, so we have our glossy material. In diffuse on this material, let's call this, just so we don't get them confused, basic snow. I'm going to leave this exactly where it's at. So it's not pure white, it's down a little bit. It's working with the lighting in our scene. If your lighting's dimmer, you might want to pump this color back up. Then if I go over to roughness, this is, if I turn this up, you can see our texture gets blurrier, goes from really shiny, gets blurrier and blurrier. So it kind of gets more of a plastic look. What I want to do here is in this texture box, I want to click the little triangle down and go to noise. Now I'm going to use a standard noise material here from Cinema 4D, which Octane kind of gets a little confused about because it looks at it as if it's an image. So what we want to do to make sure in our Octane system, go down to common and see how it says C4D shader resolution default. We want to bump that up to 2048 or something like that, just so it makes it an appropriate resolution and doesn't try and down res it too hard. Your system will work a little harder as if you have loaded an image, but it's still using that nice Cinema 4D noise system that's completely procedural. So here, I want to leave this pretty much the same, but what I want to do is I want to plop this color down from being really black down to a more gray color, maybe a light gray color. And this is just going to add a little speckling of some little hot spots throughout. I know it's really hard to see right now. Let's actually zoom in over here. Let's leave roughness how it is for now and go down to bump. Copy this from roughness here and then go ahead and paste it in our bump. And nothing will look like it's happening right now, but if you go into noise, this is a really big texture right now. So let's drop this down to like 20%. And right away, you see this top kind of bumpy texture coming in. If you want these grooves to be deeper, you can always drop this darkness down to be more black. There we go. But I kind of want it to be barely indented, almost like the snow is just beginning to get a little wet and has been sitting there for a little bit. Now that we have these grooves going on, let's go back to our roughness. We can start messing with this a little bit. So let's see what happens if we drop this down to 20 and put it way more towards the black range. You start getting a little bit of a highlight. It's probably hard to see, but you can kind of see it right here on these edges. You get a little bit of a highlight going right there. But yeah, this is the first setup. So again, really easy. It's just using basic C4D noise and a normal glossy texture, but I find this one works really well. So let's call that one basic snow. Now let's move on to number 2, which in my comp is more of this ice crystal-y snow. Let's zoom in on this guy. And again, create a new material. C4D Octane, Octane Material. Again, I'm going to switch this material type to glossy. And I'm going to leave this diffuse color exactly where it is in terms of the white value. And again, just so we can see what's going on, I'm going to drag this onto my second snow object. So we get the shiny factor going on here. And then instead of using in roughness that C4D native noise texture, I'm going to go down to C4D Octane and grab the C4D Octane noise. So I put that in. You can't really see what's going on because, again, it's a really big noise and it's set to purlin. Let's switch this over to turbulence. You can start to see something happening here in terms of glossiness. And then I want to scale this down. You can do this many ways. What I like to do is go to UV transform, pop that open, make sure lock aspect ratio is together, and then I can just drag this handle down a little bit. You won't be able to see truly what's happening here that well yet until we work on the bump. So let's go over and do that. I'm going to go back up in the stack, copy this texture that I placed in here, go over to bump and paste that in. There you go. You get this crazy bumpy texture right away. I'm going to go inside of it, start working on it a little bit. Again, you can kind of see the previous one using the Cinema 4D noise is way more neutral and kind of smooth. This Octane noise, I feel, is a lot more rough and kind of doesn't look as wet. So it works really well under those ice crystals. Let's just go ahead and scale this up a little bit. Like in 0.8. That there. That's feeling pretty good. If you switch gamma up and down, basically makes it more or less intense. But eventually it crosses over this kind of contrast point. You can mess with those if you want this to have a little more grooves to it. If you mess with this omega, it kind of makes it less or more craggly, so it kind of smooths out that noise texture. I'm going to leave it right around 0.4, and then I'm going to go to bump, copy this, go back to roughness, and paste this in. And that way it just matches it kind of perfectly. Okay, so that is our kind of underbelly roughness factor of this, and now I'm going to make the ice crystals on it. Now what works really well within Octane is, yeah, you can use a cloner object, but Octane responds really well if you use this thing in objects called Octane Scatter. So if I take this Octane Scatter and I go to distribution and I drag in my snow object 2, you get kind of this crazy hairy looking thing. You can see in your viewport over here, it looks like a bunch of dense objects together. It's currently set to vertex, and what I want to do is set it to surface. And so now it's going to look at this surface we have here and kind of scatter these around a little bit better. Again, this Octane Scatter is very similar to a cloner object, but Octane will use way less power rendering it because it looks at it as more of a shader versus tons and tons of objects. Okay, so now that we have that set, we want those ice crystals in. So what I did for that is, if you go into your base objects, I grabbed a platonic, which is kind of something you rarely ever use, but it worked really well for this because I kind of want that crystal look going on. So let's turn the radius down to 0.4. And then if I stack this under the scatter object, it'll immediately take over and be like, oh, you want to use this object inside of this scatter object. There we go. And then I actually duplicated this a few times and changed what type it is just to give it a little bit of variance. So Deca. Let's see what I picked. Tetra. Bucky. Just to give it a little bit of variance. It's really hard to see, but I like how it's going. You can scale them all at once, kind of change the radius, get to the size and shape you're liking. And then from here, it kind of just looks like weird sprinkles or something like that. So we really need to get a new material. So let's create material, extension, C4D Octane, create a new Octane material. And this time we're going to change it to a specular material. So it'll right away be this nice crystal clear material. Let's pump the roughness up a tiny bit on this thing. Let's throw it on our object so we can see what's going on. So throw it on the scatter object. And you can see right away, you get this nice clear looking glass going on. I want to take some of the specular away so we can even it out a little bit more. Reflection, let's make this more of a gray color. Makes it not as intense. And then down in index, what index is, if I turn this up, it basically gets shinier and crazier and more refractive in on itself as I go higher and higher. So the base is 1.3, but I just want to make this a little bit more refractive. Maybe we turn it up. 1.7. It's feeling good. You'll start just getting more refraction, and you'll get, more sparkling happening as you move your camera around the scene. And then another thing I like to do is if you go down to common, there's a thing called fake shadows. So if I turn that on, it kind of ignores that these are actual objects. Before, if you don't have fake shadows on, it's like, okay, this is an embedded object in geometry, so we're gonna do some ambient around it. We're gonna actually shadow these objects. And for this particular snowy crystal look, I think this just looks like frosting with some sprinkles on top of it, when really we want it to look like it's part of the snow. So if I turn on fake shadows, it right away looks way more like it's just crystallized snow sitting on top. So you can go ahead and mess around with this effect. That is pretty much it, as you can see here, pretty dang close. I'd probably scale these down a little bit more now that we have those fake shadows going. And then on the Octane Scatter, maybe I'd bump it up to like 2000. There we go. Now we have this really crystally pretty looking snow on top of our base layer of snow. That's working really well. Okay. So we have our 2 snow sets, and now let's move on to this kind of clear, slushy, melting looking snow. Zoom into this guy. There we go. So this next one is a little bit more complex, but not too hard. So let's create a new material as we've done before. Extensions, C4D, Octane Material. And we want to right away change this material type, just like the last one, to a glossy, or to a specular material, excuse me. And we want to start messing with the roughness right away. But let's apply this to our object. So throw this on here, get this totally clear material. And what we want to do, as I've shown here, is start messing with kind of the blotchiness of this texture. So you can see if I turn up the roughness here, it just gets kind of blurrier and blurrier. It gets more of like this rubber texture because it's overall softening the reflection in specular. So what we want to do is break that up a little bit to make it seem a little more uneven and icy. So if I go to texture, C4D Octane, I want to grab a gradient. And what's great about gradients is if you've ever run into the problem of using Octane noise that doesn't really have that contrast black and white settings that we had previously in our C4D noise texture, this allows you to control that. So you can see if I kind of turn this black point up, our roughness gets more clear because it's overall getting more of that black channel in here. So let's pull these down a little bit. And then what's great about this gradient is there's an option for a texture. So if I go to texture, and then I drop down to C4D Octane, and then plug that noise texture in, what's really great is it looks at this noise texture and then adds kind of this contrast gradient on top of it. So as I turn it up, there'll be more clear spots. It's kind of easier to see in this material preview over here. And then as I pull the white point down, it'll kind of make the lines a little harder. So let's put it around here. Maybe the black point up around there. I want the soft edges of this pretty nice. And then I kind of don't want it to be like perfectly clear, so I'm going to drop the white down to maybe a gray. So a lot of times what I do with a normal C4D noise texture is I'd copy this texture and I'd paste it into another channel, but Octane can kind of get confused and you have to do a lot of back and forth. And so what's great about Octane is you have this little node editor zone. So if I click on that, which this looks kind of extreme, I'm not super adept at the node editor, but what I like about it is you can very visibly see, okay, I have this noise I just made, it's going through my gradient, and then I'm plugging it into the roughness. And instead of copying and making a brand new noise texture and having to go back and forth and edit these back and forth, you can simply just take this noise node, drag it, and plug it into our bump. And then right away, it's kind of hard to see because we haven't done too much to it yet, but basically when I affect this noise texture, it will also affect this bump texture because it's been plugged in programmatically. So let's go back to our noise. Let's keep it at Perlin, maybe the octaves. You can kind of see what octaves do if you drag it around. Basically makes more and more kind of tight crunches versus larger curls. I kind of want to keep it larger, so let's do maybe about 3. Omega, let's see what that does if you drag it around. Basically kind of smooths these spots out or makes them more tight and kind of ripply. But I kind of want to keep it more of this smooth shape. I also want to invert this because I kind of want the clear patches to be more of this spotty texture. And then for gamma, leave the same. Contrast, if you pull this up and down, this is another area where you can control, again, the contrast, but that gradient scale outside of this really helps you dial it in. So the farther I push this up, the bumpier it's going to get because this noise texture is plugged into the bump, and it's also going to make this kind of icy effect more and more extreme. So I'm going to pump that up pretty heavily. Let's put it at like 7 right now, just so we can see what's going on. I might dial that down later. And then for UV transform, if you turn that on, whoops, and crack it open, you can scale as we did the other one. So I can make this pattern super, super tight and it gets really blah looking. You can scale it up. But what I did is I unlocked the aspect ratio and I turned this X value up to 5. And what I liked about that is it kind of swirled this texture, which made it feel way more icy and natural to me comparatively to keeping it kind of all one size. And then if you go to projection, click on that. If you click projection, this is pretty much always set to mesh UV, which basically just applies the texture as you would to your mesh, how your UV is laid out. But if you turn this down to XYZ to UVW, what that does is kind of no matter what the shape of your object, if it's animating or not, it allows procedural textures to kind of uniformly map and shape to your object a little bit better, and not have breakage points or be so reliant on a perfect UV. So I set it to that. And then if we go down here, I wanted to pull this overall smaller. So pull this down to maybe like 0.15. So I just pulled this X value down. So it kind of did the reverse of what I did up here for the standard transform. And now we kind of get this crazy, ripply, bumpy looking object that looks really cool and icy. If I turn the contrast down, let's try like 2. Yeah, you can see a little bit more of the clearness going on. But I like how this is looking. I would probably also go over to the index, turn that up a little bit just to make it extra icy, maybe like 1.5 again. And that is looking pretty close. Our lighting's a little bit different. We have a little more blue going on as before. So, you know, I'm getting more of this see-through blue texture rather than this orange look. If you want to kind of go crazy, again, if you go to the common tab, turn on fake shadows, you get this super kind of jelly, clear, icy look, which is kind of interesting. It's not reliant on those shadows that are underneath this object, but I'm going to turn off fake shadows for now. But yeah, that is the overall setup of these 3 snow variants. I think they turned out pretty cool. So again, we have kind of our base lumpy wet snow over here. We have our icy snow in the center, and then we have this completely melted clear slush snow going on over here. So again, a lot of this has to do with the shape of your geometry and the lighting of your scene. But what I've really found with these material setups is even if I were to change kind of this daylight setting, let's go ahead and rotate this down further. as you can see, it still holds true to kind of the snow effect. So you're still getting these little bright pops of crystals on the snow. You're still getting this overall even, smooth, lumpy texture, and you're still getting this nice refraction going through this slush snow over here, which I've found works a ton better for stylized scenes versus trying to use some type of subsurface scattering that you use for one scene with a perfect light setup, and then it's all trash from there. So hopefully this helped you guys out, and if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel, that would help us out a ton. We're shooting for a video every week, and as always, if you're interested in any 3D models, head on over to thehappytoolbox.com. We have over 500 of them, and we also have a great freebies section that will continue to grow. All right, I'll see you next time.